your with people, and that can be hard. Like you have to find a way to like deal with that, And I've seen I've seen a therapist a bunch of times who understands my industry, and there's all the insecurities that come with our industry too, of like, am I good enough? Am I, you self-doubt yourself all the time. Like it breeds insecurity on top of all the other stuff of the long hours and everything else and the creative energy.
You talked about the struggle of keeping it all in balance, being a being somebody on set that doesn't yell, trying to make the schedule work for your partner, trying to make it work for you creatively, but without getting burnout. But not everybody on the set is like that.
Hmm.
And the I think a big topic where I don't know if I'm ever going to see it fall in my lifetime is that a lot of people come from trauma, and then they end up in these if they end up in these very, very intense, stressful work situations, 12, 14, 16-hour days, it, despite them maybe being great at their job, it it leads to not just burnout but meltdown,
Hmm.
or a reliance on amphetamines, or other drugs to get them through it. I mean, are you seeing this, and are you seeing it grow?
I think, I mean, on a positive side of that, I've seen, I think there's a lot more healthy choices being made. I see people, the drug and alcohol thing, I see less of now. I mean, earlier in my career, I was aware of a lot of people who drank heavily and would come to work smelling like booze or hungover. Like it was a constant culture in our business, and I see a lot less of that now. I think the pandemic gave us all a reset in a good way. I think people started to appreciate their personal lives more. There's certainly a lot more talk of people taking, like I see it on my crew where like the grips and lighting and camera department, where one of the heads of those departments like, oh, so and so isn't coming in tomorrow because they need to take some time, or they've got a thing going on. So and of course they come to me, is that okay? Or one of my keys will say, hey, I need a day tomorrow. I got to go. I have this appointment, or I got to deal with my kids thing or whatever. And of course I say, yeah, of course. Like I never say no to that, because I know what it's like being, and because I don't have that luxury as the DP. I can't do that really very easily to say, hey, I'm going to take the day off tomorrow. So when someone in one of my departments asks for that, I say, of course, like I understand, So I think
they
it's got,
they ask for a good reason. They have a good reason
they'll
if they're
tell me
gonna,
like
yeah.
yeah, like my kid has a thing, or I've got to go to this, like my a dance recital, whatever, some important thing with their
Mm-hmm.
kid, or they have whatever. I always say, yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, I understand what it takes to be in this business, and I don't want to keep people from those kind of things. And I think it's gotten better. There is a lot more awareness of mental health. It's more openly discussed, I think. Even with sort of the more macho departments like the grips and stuff like that. You mean, I can see that those people, and there's a lot of women in those departments now too. It's become a lot more diverse, that there's a more of an awareness of your mental state. It's not perfect by any means, but certainly compared to what it was 20 years ago, it's a lot better.
That's great. Don?
Yeah, I want to go back and ask you a question because you brought up like the creative impulses and you mentioned Discovery and like the Expanse was pre-volume filming, right? And I
Yes.
think Discovery leans very heavily on that. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, any experience on filming a volume, sort of if that feels like stifling a little bit, just any thoughts on that front?
I mean, I don't have a ton of experience with it. I've done a little bit. I've shot a couple of small things on a volume stage, and we actually looked into it in the last season of Expanse
You did. And a
to see if
volume
we could
stage,
use
just
it.
for just for people listening, it's basically a large curved LED wall. So instead of doing months of post production afterwards, all the pre production happens earlier. You stick up a sun there, the sun stays up there, and the light plays on the character. Roughly,
Yeah, it's the
very
Mandalorian
yeah.
thing that people are most familiar with, and
Wow.
it's that's so I yeah, we looked into that, and it didn't work for Expanse only because the workflow was backwards. Everything had to happen up front, and the
Yep.
show, when you're on a show that's already, the train is already moving like that, it's very difficult to change your schedule. Like, oh, now we need 3 months before we shoot to build all the assets for the wall. And there's certain things it's really great for, in my experience, and it definitely will become more and more used. But it does. have limitations. It's like some people look at it as like, oh, it's the holy grail. Like we can do everything in there. You don't have to go anywhere anymore. But you can't interact with it in the sense of like it's great for like big vistas or like you're building a piece of a landscape and that's like the vista beyond, or you're in like a ship or like a boat or something and it's the ocean and the
Yeah,
sky
you still need
beyond.
some
But
foreground elements.
you still need the floor and you still need the foreground things. And
Yeah.
the trick is like if it's certain kinds of spaces, like actors can't like walk into it. You can't go down a hallway in it or
Mhm.
around a corner or move big distances because you're still constrained within that like floor space that's around the wall. So
Right.
it's great for certain things, but it also does. There are a lot of costs, and you can't focus on it directly. When you get certain angles, you can, but if you focus directly on it, you start seeing the
Yeah.
pixels.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like it has limits, and it's not cheap. It's very expensive. So
Yeah.
it's the amount of time you have to build the assets
I just feel
and
like
all
I'm
that.
watching a show and you see the actors, they're walking certain steps, then cut because they hit
The
what they
end,
can do.
Yeah.
yeah,
And
Yeah.
also correct me if I'm wrong. And this is something that I don't know for sure, but doesn't it, depending on the size of the screen, doesn't it kind of limit your focal lengths and certain camera
yeah,
moves and stuff like that?
yep.
So you're just stuck in a certain very limited range of focal lengths. And I mean, that has to be difficult. No?
It is tricky. Well, you can't, it's tricky to look straight, like very steep, like looking down or very
Mhm.
low looking up because
Yeah.
you start seeing off the wall. And then you're getting into like VFX anyways to extend what's there. I mean, a lot of not all, but there's certainly a great deal of VFX cleanup that happens with those wall shots anyways. It doesn't eliminate post
It's not
entirely.
yeah, what you see is what you get, and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
still have some cleanup to do.
And not to get too in the weeds here, but what about, full on green screen but with Unreal? Is that something I mean that's something we're
Yeah,
exploring on basically here just on the on the commercial corporate side of what I do, but like
no,
to me
it's
that's
a
more
thing. I mean,
freedom. Yeah.
well, we looked at that too. There's a company in Toronto called Mavericks Visual Effects, and they did a lot of work on Handmaid's Tale, and Brendan Taylor is the guy who runs the company, and he's very much been developing that, and other companies are doing it too. But I've gone into their shop a few times and seen what they're doing, and the whole notion of having real time um, comping of the background. So if you're on a blue screen or green screen set with an extension piece, the ability to have like to me that's actually an even more uh, interesting or a universal application of that technology where you're using it to augment in real time the extension of what you're going to be putting into the shot that you're shooting of. Like you've got half of a set and then green screen beyond that. You can put the asset that's doesn't have to be fully done because you're not actually photographing it, but you can have it on the monitor as a preview. And so when you move the camera and you're lighting it, you at least have the thing that's going to be there on the monitor as kind of a reference of like this is what it will be, knowing that of course it's going to get rendered better and more later,
High
but at
quality.
least you have a good high quality preview of it, and that to me is really useful because now you're not having to guess, looking at it. And you may have like a piece of concept art, and then the visual effects person's there, and you're looking at this shot with a giant piece of blue in it, and you're like, well, what exactly is back there? How is the light coming from there? And you're trying to like make that work with what's really in front of the camera. But if you could see it on a monitor, you're like, oh, well, now you can really tune it in.
Yeah.
In the days of film, they relied on, color timing in the wash of the film. Now a lot of uh cinematography, not no, that's not the case, but some part of the cinematography is done in post and the color correction. Do you have a lot, is your voice involved in that process too, or is it left out and you're frustrated if somebody, completely changes uh you know shooting in raw? They can change all sorts of things.
Sure. Well, I make sure that I'm involved. I contractually make sure that I'm involved. I mean, with the Expanse, I was involved with every episode's color timing. So to me, it's as important as the shooting part. Like it's like a photographer who doesn't go into the dark room,
Hmm.
and let somebody else print the picture for them. It's like there's so much influence on what that final thing will be that also is tied into what you intended when you shot it. So you
Hmm.
kind of need to be there because there's certain things that when you're shooting it that you're going to time it a certain way that you have to be there to make sure that that part is done because you're thinking of the final color as you're shooting, knowing you're going to make it cooler or you're going to darken a certain thing that,
Right.
we're not going to spend time flagging off that wall.
Right.
We know we can just darken that one little thing. So you need to be there to make sure the colorist knows that and that you can do it how you want. So I always make sure that I'm there. I think I mean, and most of my DP colleagues, like it's something we make sure we're there.
The what about shots that are completely CG, like the way the distant sun, the light might hit a ship? Are
Mm.
you involved even in that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, because we still color grade those shots,
Hmm.
and we'll often see previews of them, and chime in on what it should be. Like, if the sun isn't bright enough, like we went through a lot of that with Expanse because there were so many visual effects vendors. I think that we have like 6 or 7 vendors, and the creation of the ships and set extensions and things was split up amongst different vendors. So it was a trick to get everyone to be consistent with how they lit their ships in
Hmm.
space. And some were darker than others, some were brighter. And we ended up, as we got through it, and the rain was very specific with that stuff too. He had very specific notes with how the space shots looked, is that we started to have to create like almost like a Bible of like, how do you expose for the ship? So when the
Hmm.
vendors are making these things and they're lighting it virtually, like we would say, make sure you give us this stop range of like the shadows of the ship should be this many stops under the brightest part. Because we don't, because sometimes it'd be like the highlights were too bright and there wasn't enough in the shadows. So we couldn't compress it. And then, so we would send the shots back and say, you have to redo this.
Yeah.
And that's so that once we got into that rhythm, it became kind of a pattern of this is how you expose for ships.
Hmm.
When people think about a cinematographer, what they're probably not thinking about is Foley and sound. But you
Right.
have an interest.
It's true.
So, in a very strange pivot, this is one of the things that you and I've talked. You've sent me something in the past, and this is
Hmm.
how we've communicated. But like, talk to us. What is Foley? That's for you, Trevor, because I know you went to film school, and
Hmm.
I don't know what they did at school. But your interest in it, and going back to track stars, I know, and it seems odd because usually most, at least here in Boston, all the DPs that I know, if anything related to sound is near them, they just push them to the side and say, "Get away
Sure.
from me." Yeah.
I mean, that came from sort of a childhood interest in sound. I mean, I was interested in pictures and sound as a kid, and I think if I hadn't gone into photography, I would have ended up in the sound world in some way, whether it's in sound design or music production. I would have. That's something I've always had an interest in, and so because of that, as a kid, I remember seeing on our local like kind of like our version of PBS basically in Ontario, which is TV Ontario.
Hmm.
They used to show like art films and like National Film Board stuff, and there was a film on there called Track Stars, which was made in '79, I believe, and it was Andy Malcolm, who is one of the foremost Foley artists in the world, made this film for fun with his friends in '79, and it kind of became this thing that you'd see on TV randomly at like late at night or whatever. And so I remember seeing that, and that's kind of what exposed me to what I didn't really know what Foley was as a kid. And I think as soon as I saw that film, I understood the concept of you make a movie and then you have to replace certain sounds later, and you have craftspeople who go into a studio and basically mimic the sound of footsteps and picking things up off a table and closing doors and all that kind of stuff. Whatever wasn't captured well on the film set, you're replacing it all later, but it has to be performed by somebody to the picture in the studio. And that idea, I didn't really, that was a new thing for me as a kid. And I always had this interest in it. And my parents knew that. And when I was 16, they surprised me. And this, of course, is way before the internet. This like, I don't even know how they figured this out, but they somehow managed to figure out where Andy worked in Toronto, and it was a company that became Deluxe, but back then was called Filmhouse,
Yeah.
and it was downtown Toronto, and Andy worked there. That's where he had his studio, and they've managed to figure that out, and they surprised me from my 16th birthday that they were going to take me to meet Andy, and Andy was into it, and I remember my dad drove me into the city and dropped me off, and he said, "Well, if you're bored, I'll come back and get you, whatever." But I was dropped off at like 9 in the morning, and I stayed there for the entire day and watched them work, and I ended up going back several times and visiting with them and watching various films that Andy was working on, and it left like a huge impression on me. And of course, I never went into that world, but I always appreciated it and always had a love for it, even though it ended up being not the thing I pursued. And then years later, I hadn't, that probably like 25 years went by, And I knew that Andy was out there, but I kind of lost touch with him. I went off and did my thing. And then I remember thinking like, oh, I wonder